Sorry, it was.
Did you chuck me out?
Yes, you were speaking.
Okay, hello. So
Yep, I'm
do we
making you
have
co-host.
perfect. And
Hi.
hi.
Hi, Rose. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yeah, I can hear you. I'll
Okay.
make you a co-host for the event if you're
Yeah.
not already.
Hello.
Oh no.
Hi, Pooja.
Hi, Patricia. Hi, Chennai.
Rose.
Hi
Chennai.
everyone.
Hi, everyone.
Annelle,
Hi,
can you
Sonia.
please, Annelle,
Yep.
could you make me the host, or could you make everyone else co-host?
Yes,
And pause the
I'm
recording.
making everyone else co-host now.
And could you pause the recording as well?
On Facebook, you know,
Just like in general, because we don't really like need to record this bit.
it is recording now, isn't it?
No, I mean, could you? It says recording at the top of my screen.
All right.
It might be recording but not streaming. I don't know if there's any difference.
Yes, it is recording, I think.
Yes, so if you could just pause it.
You gave me the controls.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this event on financing for development. My name is Pooja Rangaprasad, and I will be moderating this session today. Before we dive in, we do have translation, and of course, the instructions are on your screen. So please do click on the globe icon and choose the language that you want to listen to this discussion in. As I said, my name is Pooja Rangaprasad. I'm based in India and I work for Society for International Development. This event is being organized by the Civil Society Financing for Development Group, which is an open civil society platform of hundreds of organizations and networks from around the world who are interested and engaged in the financing for development process in the United Nations. We, of course, have a wonderful panel of experts who are also members of this network who will speak to some of the key issues within this process and some of the key issues that are really critical in this time in history. But just a little bit of background to those who may not be familiar in the history of the financing for development process. It was something that really emerged and was pushed by developing countries in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis of the late 90s. The first FFD conference was in 2002, and it was really an attempt by developing countries to recover the voice and the role of the United Nations on issues of global finance and the economy, which had been sidelined over the years by undemocratic forums and spaces such as the IMF, World Bank, and the OECD. So while these issues are, of course, very technical, but really the heart of it is the political struggle for the democratization of global economic governance and to really shift the normative and standard setting role on these issues to the United Nations, where all developing countries have a voice and a vote. So in the context of this current crisis, while of course you have the global North economies who are able to pursue recovery through large stimulus packages and hoarding vaccines, global South countries, of course, faced with vaccine apartheid and unbearable restrictions on their policy and fiscal space, suffocated by illicit financial flows, unfair trade and investment regimes, unsustainable debt burdens, and policy conditionalities. There's really an urgent need to bring global finance back into democratic accountability rather than being a siphoning mechanism that extracts wealth, exploits labor, amplifies inequalities, and destabilizes the global economy. Really the key priorities, decolonizing the global economy. And of course, these global systemic issues cannot be addressed at just the national or regional level alone, and really requires an ambitious multilateral response under the auspices and leadership of the United Nations. And we, as the civil society FFD group, have really been calling on governments to really agree on the next FFD conference, which should be in the form of an international economic reconstruction and systemic reform summit to work towards global consensus on a new global economic governance architecture that could foster systemic reforms while promoting human rights, gender equality, social equity, and environmental justice. So with just that little bit of opening remarks, I will turn to our panel of speakers. We, of course, don't have a lot of time and a lot of interesting issues to get through. And our first speaker in this will be Jason Braganza, who is with African Forum and Network on Debt and Development. Jason, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Pooja, and thank you everybody for providing Afrodad with this wonderful platform to share with you some of our thoughts from the continent, and to sort of locate the conversation. I'd like to share with the comrades the Harare Declaration 2021, a new debt movement to make Africa a rule maker and not a rule taker. This is a document that was agreed and adopted just over a month ago at our inaugural African conference on debt and development. And the idea here was really to rejuvenate the African civil society debt movement and to get citizens and civil society organizations talking again with regard to the debt crisis that is afflicting the continent. There has been a lot of conversation around, the crisis being caused by COVID-19, but we do realize, and we're now very much more aware that this is really not the case. COVID-19 only really just accelerated the debt crisis that the African continent is facing. And the debt crisis in itself has permeated the continent in very different ways. The continent has been open to do business with all sorts of stakeholders, some more conventional or less conventional than others. And as a result of that, and the appetite to invest on the continent and the appetite for finance in order to finance the development agenda on the continent has meant that our governments have had this wanton desire to borrow almost uncontrollably. And on the lending side, because of the promise of returns, investors have come, running, very, very quickly onto the continent. And so what this means really over the past 20 years or so is that since HIPC and MDRI, many of you will have been familiar with that, with those two debt relief or debt cancellation initiatives in the early 2000s. Really, since then, nothing much has changed with regard to the fiscal space that was created. And we do find ourselves in the situation as we did in the early 2000s. But an interesting aspect in this crisis is the context and the setup and the structure of the creditor system that African governments have faced with. And so the Harare Declaration really is about one that looks to rebalance that equation. And as Pooja said, rebalance the political economy of how decisions are made, and one that equalizes how African governments and their creditors negotiate. And particularly looking at roles of certain actors like credit rating agencies and their role in the current crisis in slowing down the ability to reach a global framework or common framework, a real common framework on debt relief. And so it also then calls for an accountability mechanism, an African accountability mechanism that acts as the foundation for enhanced transparency, accountability, and governance. And as part of that, and as part of making Africa, or pushing towards Africa being a rule maker and not a rule taker, the declaration does ask for us to have a continental common position and consensus on sovereign debt. And these measures should go beyond just, agreeing to the current relief measures that are being put on the table, but actually challenging the position of the continent.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I think the translators are requesting that you speak a little slowly.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I'll try. Okay. So I'll just start from the second point, which is about a common African position and consensus on sovereign debt, which goes beyond the the immediate measures that are being put on the table at the current moment, and also urges that we try and create some form of African financial architecture if we are going to have our own financial independence. We also look at the idea of the African Union to strengthen the collective learning and coordination around debt negotiations outcomes, including on interest rates, the grace periods, environment, labor, and other clauses that affect African citizens. This is based on the understanding that the debt that our governments accrue invariably tend to be paid back, or the costs tend to be transferred onto citizens, and therefore when our governments are negotiating loan contracts, they need to have these aspects in mind, so they don't have to automatically transfer the cost of these loans to citizens. The fourth point around the declaration is also about alternative approaches, and in particular one that looks at a feminist lens to macroeconomic research, analysis, and policy formulation, one that has an African derived and led green recovery that is in tandem with the African Union's Agenda 2063. And the idea here really is to Africanize these global topics, and this is what the Harare Declaration seeks to do, is really contextualize it and not let the continent or the continental CSOs be a rubber stamping machine for global conversations. And so in this particular ask, we want to encourage civil society, academics, policymakers, and governments to really look at what it means for some of these global issues from an African context. And then to reclaim back the social contract on the continent, as the paradigms around development finance have evolved to include a lot of more private related finance, it seems the social contract that where accountability lies between the citizen and the state, this has actually gradually been eroded with the neoliberal agenda, where the relationship between citizen and the state seems to have been reduced to just locking out participation and merely seeking votes for re-election and coming back into power, as opposed to the actual service delivery and accountability. Instead, we see government and private sector actually locked in to a different type of social contract that supports profiteering over the rights and of citizens. And so the declaration is really about fighting back and trying to reclaim that space. And as Pooja said, part of the global process is also trying to do that. And finally, like I said at the beginning, this declaration is about renewing the civil society movement on debt issues, and more specifically, but development finance more broadly on the continent, to ensure that we can move towards a place where Africa is to be a rule maker and not a rule taker, and essentially just to get a better deal in all the interactions that our governments and our citizens get involved in. Thank you very much. And these are just the organizations that have signed up to it. It's still an open declaration that organizations can sign up to, and we'll share the link with you. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason, for that very succinct presentation. And as Jason mentioned, I think he will share the link in the chat box if you wish to join this. But I think now what we'll do is go from this presentation of what is really a civil society mobilization effort on the continent in Africa to Iolanda Fresnillo from the European Network on Debt and Development, who will talk to us about some of the global efforts around campaigning that are upcoming around debt. So Iolanda, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks everyone for participating today. As Jason was mentioning, the debt movement has been putting out there alternative solutions on how to address the multiple debt crisis and other crises, social, gender, environmental crisis linked to that. On the table of policymakers, international institutions, national governments for a long time now, starting in the mid-90s with the Jubilee campaigns until the mid-2000s. And in January 2007, that's ages ago, it seems ages ago, we met at the World Social Forum in Nairobi, different people participating in social movements and particularly debt social movements. And we call for a debt week of action for debt cancellation. So the proposal I'm going to be sharing today comes as far back as 2007. These mobilizations that took normally place during the World Bank and IMF annual meetings, so in October, kept on going for several years, but then kind of diffused in a number of other fights. But last year, as the COVID-19 pandemic worsened the economic perspective, and particularly the debt situation and debt vulnerabilities in the countries in the global south, we got back together, many CSOs from all over the world, many networks like Eurodad, Latindadd, Afrodad, APMDD, Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, Jubilee USA, and many others, together to fight against debt. We convened this once again, this Global Week of Action for Debt Cancellation. What you're seeing here is the action that we took virtually because of the COVID restrictions last year on parallel, while the IMF and the World Bank were representatives were meeting. We were also meeting in a wonderful rally that the colleagues from APMDD organized. If we can go to the next slide. The news are that we are calling for these days of action. It's come from 1 week to a couple of weeks. So Global Days of Action for Debt Cancellation. And it's going to take place between the 14th and the 31st of October this year. So we are again coming together, even if it's not possible to do it physically, at least virtually and at our countries. To once again demand debt cancellation by all lenders and to all countries that need that debt cancellation of unsustainable and illegitimate debts, and that for that debt cancellation to be unconditional, but also to make sure that borrowing governments that stop making debt payments don't suffer for any kind of penalties for doing so, promoting national debt audits, citizens audits or government audits at a national level, to review and change the lending, borrowing, and payment policies to prevent new unsustainable and illegitimate debt. Also to promote a fair, transparent, binding multilateral framework for debt crisis resolution under the auspices of the UN, which is not lender-dominated. At present, any debt treatment is actually led by the creditors themselves, who play both part and the judge role in debt restructuring, and mainly to apply the primacy of human rights in all these debt treatments. We also call for reparations for the damages caused to the countries, peoples, and nature due to the contracting, use, and payment of these unsustainable and illegitimate debts. How are we going to do that? And I'm going to go to the next slide. There are a number of opportunities, like advocacy opportunities, official events coming in our calendars, starting with the UN General Assembly that is taking place these days, and this Global People's Assembly in parallel to the UN General Assembly. But also the UNCTAD 15 conference and the Civil Society Forum on UNCTAD 15, where we will also raise our proposals and alternatives approaches to debt resolution, and particularly the IMF and World Bank annual meetings. With the G20 Finance Ministers meeting, there's going to be, again, actions around October 15th that marks the anniversary of the Thomas Sankara assassination. He was one of those African leaders calling, as Jason was reminding us, for a unite front against debt. We will also look at what is being discussed at the Financing Commons Summit. And this year in particularly, after the G20 summit, we will be very attentive of what happens in the COP26. Our colleagues in the African continent, I'm seeing some strides there, are going to organize an African People's Counter COP at the end of October, and we will organize several actions regarding debt and climate. And I'm going to finalize with the final slide, which summarizes the actions that we are actually going to take. So first of all is global coordinated actions in different forms. There's probably going to be 2 dates to concentrate those actions, 14th or 15th and 27th or 28th of October. This is going to be decided this Friday. Also, there is going to be a global coordinated action on no climate justice without debt justice. There's a mistake there, on October 22nd. So you will probably get news on a Twitter storm and social media storm asking or demanding debt cancellation for climate justice. And we're preparing this with climate movements together with debt movements. There's going to be a new common statement, and you can, of course, support that one. Our colleagues from the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development will lead again in organizing an international virtual concert rally like the one we had last year, a wonderful one. And here you have like different email listservs, email contact, the website, and the Twitter and Facebook account to follow up on social media on these different opportunities. I'm gonna share the email on the chat box just in case anyone missed it, and I'm gonna leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Iolanda, for that update. There's a lot coming up. There will be an opportunity, I think, at the end of this for anyone to ask questions. So please make a note of it. So from all of the mobilization efforts on debt, we now move to talking about tax. And here I'm happy to introduce Chenai Mukumba from Tax Justice Network Africa, who will give us an overview of what's happening on this. Thanks, Chenai, over to you.
Thanks so much, Pooja, and thanks so much for inviting us as Tax Justice Network Africa to be able to share some of our thoughts around the current conversations with regards to tax. So I think very briefly, maybe just to give a bit of context, before I moved to Tax Justice Network Africa, I used to work for a national NGO. And when I moved to Tax Justice Network Africa, where our work is much more focused on regional and global conversations, I was shocked to realize that so many of the issues that we're facing at the national level draw from conversations that are happening at the international level, at the global level. So right now, as most people within the tax space would know, there's a conversation that's currently going on about a corporate global minimum income tax. And what's being proposed is that countries implement a minimum tax rate of 15%. So to give a bit of context to this, the current conversation was sort of spearheaded by the US, and then there was the G7 Ministers of Finance meeting that agreed that 15% probably would be most appropriate. And then this deal was then later endorsed by the OECD that released a statement, and we've increasingly seen a number of countries, both developed and developing, unfortunately, sign on to this 15% minimum corporate income tax. And the reason we see this as problematic is for a number of issues. As TJNA, we held a webinar a couple of weeks ago where we brought together various stakeholders, including the African Tax Administration Forum. But what came out of that conversation was not a conversation that's only specific to the African context. It was a conversation that really is specific to the global South in general. So when we're taking a look at what's being proposed by the OECD, and conversations are going to happen later in October with regards to endorsing that particular statement, it's a little bit, I no longer find it shocking because now I'm getting used to it. But the 15% corporate minimum income, global minimum corporate income tax is much closer to the income tax rates that are put forward by tax havens. In Africa, for example, countries have corporate income tax rates between 25 and 35%. And this is so essential for our domestic resource mobilization. Globally, the corporate income tax ranges closer to 25%. And so this 15%, if anything, doesn't actually do away with what it was supposed to do away with, which is the shifting of profits, right, from relatively high tax jurisdictions to lower tax jurisdictions. And so, for example, if a multinational enterprise, for example, is being taxed, or 25%, for example, in an African country, there is still room for them to engage in aggressive tax planning, for them to shift to a jurisdiction with a lower tax rate. And so on this basis, TJNA, alongside various regional institutions that fall under the umbrella of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, are saying that this is completely insufficient. The proposals that countries from the global south have been putting forward to the OECD are not reflected within this current conversation. And not only that, the fact that this conversation is stemming from the OECD is also problematic. And the reason is because as institutions, as the tax justice movement, we have always been saying that we need to have these conversations in a platform that is much more inclusive, in a platform that is able to incorporate the voices of everybody on an equal and level playing field. But when you take a look at what's currently taking place within the OECD, you see proposals that are being put forward, but not being incorporated. Also, you tend to find that, for example, there's 139 countries within the OECD, and only 26 of those are African countries. So the extent to which, you're able to then have conversations where your interests are reflected is minimal. And so to this degree, we actually at present are running a campaign that is really saying no to this global tax deal. And I will share within the chat, because we would love for as many civil societies as possible to sign on to this, because what it essentially does is perpetuates the problem that we have now. In how would I say this? In principle, a global minimum corporate tax would actually be something that developing countries could come behind, insofar as it was able to meaningfully contribute to the retaining of domestic resources within countries. But because of what's being proposed, that's insufficient a rate to do so. And for us, particularly within the African context, and I absolutely know that this is the same for various other global South countries, having a corporate tax rate that is so low, because it will not address this particular concern, is not something that we would want to sign on to or agree to, because at the end of the day, it is much more difficult to undo something that's been agreed, rather than just agree on something that is workable, particularly for the most for developing countries, for the most vulnerable, within our spaces. And so essentially, just to reiterate what I said before, we are really trying to put a campaign that is saying no to this deal, because it doesn't, in essence, benefit developing countries to the extent that we would need something like this. So like I said, Pooja, I'm happy to end there, but I'm going to put within the chat this statement that TJNA, as well as various other regional partners, have worked to put together, that really speaks out against this issue, this conversation that's not inclusive, that doesn't reflect or represent Global South voices, and essentially is actually going to benefit developed countries much more than developing countries, particularly when you start to look into the actual detail. The blatantness of the way in which this is going to happen is quite surprising. So I had 5 minutes, Pooja. I hope I didn't go too over time, but I will put that in the chat and then happy to have conversations afterwards.
Thank you, Chennai. That was great. And like you said, it's really outrageous that in the midst of this crisis, we actually have a deal that will result in more revenues for developed countries and not developing countries, compounding the inequalities of what has been a historically unjust international tax system. So thank you so much. I know she will be sharing the link in the chat box, so please do join the campaign, and we very much look forward to having everyone's involvement in future conversations. So with that, I will now invite Luca De Fraia with ActionAid Italy, who will give us an update on some of the developments that have happened on integrated national financing frameworks, as well as some of our concerns around sort of the critique of a private finance first approach to development finance, as well as aid effectiveness. Sorry, can you hear me? Did I get cut off?
No, we can hear you.
Okay.
Pretty well.
Great. Over to you, Luca.
Thank you, Pooja, and thank you so much for sharing this very short presentation. And you may easily understand it's a great pleasure to be on this call after so distinguished colleagues that address issues such as debt and tax. Integrated national financing frameworks is a relatively new concept, and still this is about how countries are planning to fund their SDGs plans. So definitely integrated national financing frameworks are part of the big agenda, 2030 agenda, and the big Addis Ababa action agenda package. And today we're going to just present some basic elements of these integrated financial frameworks. And as I said, this is relatively new. So even CSOs are just now trying to familiarize better with these frameworks. So next, please. And I'm going to start with the very basic elements, so trying to provide you with some ideas what INFFs are. And basically, I think the most appropriate reference is actually the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, specifically Chapter 9. And that refers to nationally owned development plans to be supportive by the international community through the Addis Ababa Action Agenda and the 2030 Agenda. And these nationally owned plans must be properly funded. And so here we have this idea of national financing strategies. And to me, it's still very surprising to see that just within a space of a few lines, Addis Ababa Action Agenda addresses many issues at the same time. We have the issue of country leadership on development processes. We have the issue of national plans. We have the issue of financing these national plans. And so this is the essence of the integrated financing frameworks. And this is possibly easily explains why we are so interested in how these frameworks are getting developed right now by the international community. And more specifically, some platforms, along with the CSO FFD group, I'm happy to refer to the CPD, which is the CSO Platform Effective Development. We are so keen to understand better what these frameworks are about. I'm also including this initial slide that there is in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. Always very important not to forget that a clear commitment to safeguarding national leadership on their own development, national leadership of partner countries on their development plans. And we know that this is very nice language, very nice messages, but it's always a challenge to make sure that this is happening. And this adds extra interest on our part into this process. So in the essence, INFFs are national plans to make sure that the finance resources available of all forms, in all forms, are aligned with SDGs priorities. Next. And this is a very basic picture that tells you about how these frameworks are getting now developed. This is nothing new in principle. We have building blocks. This is a very standard methodology. And we have 4 major building blocks: governance and coordination, assessment and diagnostics, financing strategy, and monitoring and review. So this is a quite complex system. And we can easily understand from this very basic picture the different challenges that may come with the integrated financing frameworks. And governance and coordination, obviously, we're very keen to make sure that all stakeholders are involved at the national level. CSOs and other non-executive stakeholders, we're expecting to be involved in the making of these financial plans, financial frameworks. Assessment and diagnostic, we're going to see when we're going to go through the CSO concerns that we are worried about these diagnostics because we fear that these diagnostics may pave the way for a greater role for the international institutions in shaping what countries are then expected to do, and so on and so forth. So this picture where the building blocks is already telling us about the challenges and the kind of threats we need to be very careful about. And I think we could use this picture also to note that financing frameworks, these integrated financing frameworks, are not actually including the outflows. And this is one of the big challenges that we have raised from the start, or at least, the very least, we can say that there is no clarity whether or not outflows will be properly put into the picture. And one may say this very much depends on the countries leading on these processes, whether or not they're going to have the strength, the capacity, the ability to include also elements about inflows. And we know this is extremely important. We cannot have a reliable picture of the resources available for implementing SDGs if we do not take into account outflows. And we know that international community is very responsive, is really responsible for the outflows. Next, please. And this is just another example of the complexity that may come with integrated financing framework. So nothing extremely new, so there is a mapping of the needs, but the essence of this process in principle, according to the international community, is to make sure there is a proper matching between the needs and the financing available. Any kind of financing, I'm very keen to reassert this point quite clearly. So we're not just talking about concessional resources, we're not just talking about ODA, and you see immediately the links to fair policies in the area of debt management and fair policies in the area of taxation. And good to note that in principle, any country implementing the integrated financing framework should be also put in place a proper governance in place, governing body, and with an overview committee as well. And these two bodies, for instance, this kind of governance, for instance, may create space for a proper CSO monitoring and CSO engagement. Good to notice also that there is a mention also to the impediments, the blockers, the elements that can actually prevent countries to get access to resources. And we know what may come with that. We know that we may have policy reform plans in the pipeline with the usual narrative about the friendly environment to make sure, for instance, that private resources may be welcome in countries. Next, please. And this is just a very simple map of the pilot countries, of the countries that have been involved insofar till this moment in this process. And there's a plenty of countries you may see, so possibly you can spot the country where you live in. And so it would be interesting then to further continue this conversation to get your sense of whether or not these is actually happening in your country. I was actually forgetting to mention that the international institutions leading on this effort are the UNDP, with the support of some other big country groupings such as the European Union, and we have the involvement of other sectors of the UN family. But as I said, it would be great to have a sense from your own countries whether or not you You heard about these processes. When we asked in the past whether or not CSOs should be involved, the standard feedback we received, yes, we expected stakeholders to be involved. So the big challenge is make sure that this stakeholder engagement is actually taking place. There is a very interesting, useful website. It's very easy to find out, INFFF. You Google that, you're going to find the official website, so you can have more details on where your country actually stands in this process. Next, and I'm moving to the kind of conclusion of my short presentation. So as CSOs, we started we started looking into the INFFs from the start. That's the call that, for instance, in 2019, the Global Progress Report on FFD published a very extensive sector thematic chapter on FFS. So from that moment on, CSOs from the CSO FFD group started engaging this process on a regular basis. We put together some reactions, we put together some comments, and here is a kind of summary of what we think at the moment. This is not comprehensive, this is just a very easy, very simple summary, bullet points. And so the first concern is about undermining national leadership because of the role of it, for instance, institutions in the diagnostic, in setting the policies, in setting the background. And our concern is also about making sure that CSOs and other non-executive actors are involved in countries' development of their plans. It may be argued that this is actually in the hands of national governments. Fair enough. Definitely the international community may kind of have a role in making sure that the different stakeholders are consulted and in setting these financial frameworks. And as I mentioned throughout the presentation, we are worried that the integrated financial frameworks are not based on a proper assessment of outflows, and this would be a major flaw because the picture would not be comprehensive, would be very limited to the incoming resources. And the systemic concern is about that through this kind of process, the international community, the official donors may be tempted to dilute their commitments because they may be tempted to pass the buck to countries, shifting the responsibility of funding their development process directly to countries. We are not obviously playing down the importance and the role that countries should play in funding their own development, but the international community cannot actually step back and actually should step up their efforts. And then there is this concern that we are referring to as the localization of the UNFFD agenda, that this is really about turning a systemic global agenda into something that is local and that countries are or would be supposed to deal with directly without a proper role for the international community. So we are a start of a process, start of a journey when it comes to CSOs, and we have together with some colleagues from the CSO FFD group this idea of creating a CSO hub to further look into this, also to come up with proper assessment, proper understanding of the different frameworks or the different policies in place. So if you are interested, get in touch with Pooja or get in touch with me directly, and we're going to further develop this process. The most immediate deadline seems to be a bit far away, but it's April next year when we're going to have another UNFFD forum. And ideally, for that kind of deadline, we would like to have a more comprehensive CSO position in time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luca, for that comprehensive overview. Because on the one hand, of course, we are all, campaigning and staying focused on these global systemic issues on debt and tax. And in the meantime, we're seeing this huge push with these integrated national financing frameworks, which really risks, as Luca mentioned, localizing the FFD agenda and taking the focus away from these systemic issues. So we do need to monitor, I think, what these conversations are looking like and the role of IFIs in the process, and really keeping an eye on some of these risks that Luca mentioned. So thank you so much for that overview. With this, we move on to the next speaker, which is Patricia Miranda from Latindadd, who will give us an update on the campaign on SDRs. Patricia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Pooja, and greetings to everyone connected today. Well, the access to financing, as we've been listening through in this panel, is a key part of the divergent and unequal recovery of the crisis. This is no new. It is an unfair situation that has been happening in the global financial architecture, for instance, to finance SDGs or to finance climate. In the worst crisis in more than 100 years, central banks of rich countries created trillions of dollars, euros, and pounds, much of which could make it into their fiscal budgets. Countries that could have access to these monetary policies represent the 17% of the population. The rest of the countries that represent 83% of the population are left to monetary multilateralism to fight COVID, mainly to have access to debt, to more credits and more loans, and with the IMF. Urgent financing needs were more than evident. Fiscal revenues decreased, therefore budget gaps increased, and the pandemic forced our countries to increase public expenditures. Developing countries need concessional financing, no more debt, especially under the risks of the current debt landscape. In this context, the issuance of special drawing rights, a political decision to create liquidity, was the answer. And it was the call from different stakeholders and governments, and also many voices that were part of a campaign in 2020 last year, advocating for the issuance of $3 trillion in special drawing rights. Knowing that the needs of developing countries were beyond that figure. Moreover, when only 1/3 of that would be allocated to middle and low-income countries. Still, it would certainly contribute to provide resources to finance urgent expenditures on health as vaccines, on social protection, on gender equality, and other needs. After 17 months of the pandemic outbreak, finally, $650 billion of SDRs were allocated. Despite only $230 billion went to developing countries, if we don't take into account China, this allocation can be important for budget support, as the IMF itself states in their guidance notes. So a few countries are indeed using this allocation for budget support to be able to finance health and social expenditures, or repaying non-concessional debt in some cases. Unfortunately, many countries still don't have clarity on the mechanisms that can be applied to use SDRs as budget support. This is urgently needed, so they will not be kept or saved in reserves when most of our countries do not have a reserve problem. They have a fiscal problem, and it is finally the people that need public policies to survive this crisis. Why an allocation of SDRs is a good option? Because it means no debt, it's not a loan, it doesn't involve a capital repayment, it has no conditionalities, and only a small interest rate of 0.05% will be paid for the amount used. It doesn't involve any program or any kind of loan with the IMF. So in this context, it is the best concessional financing for urgent needs, but they need to be well used, be smart used, as it is a one-time allocation. At the same time, developed countries that do not use the allocation, the allocation that they have received, they can voluntarily, on a voluntary basis, transfer their special drawing rights to developing countries in need. It is essential that the recent allocation be quickly followed by a rechanneling, of these resources, channeling a really meaningful portion of advanced economies SDRs to developing countries. Besides still calling and putting on the table that our governments can use SDRs for fiscal purposes, as it is in our handbook, and I'm going to put this handbook in the chat if some of you have not seen it yet, because it's important that our governments know what are the channels that they can use. Besides this, our current campaign is on the criteria that should be used for rechanneling special drawing rights from developed countries to developing countries, while keeping the spirit of the original allocation by not generating more debt and not having conditionalities. Be accessible to middle-income countries, be additional and available to use them as budget support. To achieve all these criteria or principles, as we have been calling, it will be important to identify channels and mechanisms that can be adapted to the current circumstances and challenges, to make available in a faster way the resources to the countries in need. Therefore, the IMF current mechanisms may not be the main option. Other vehicles or funds should be considered, mechanisms with equal voice and vote, and in the interest of the most in need. Moreover, this experience reflects that this type of financing through special drawing rights allocation reflects that future allocations can take place in the future to finance a development and to contribute to leave no one behind. I would also like to mention that in the recent days, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, as an intergovernmental mechanism for dialogue and political agreement, which includes 33 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, called the IMF to ensure timely access to special drawing rights, and also is supporting the immediate establishment of SDRs redistribution mechanism for all vulnerable countries, including middle-income countries. This will allow a more expeditious, fair, inclusive, and equal economic recovery in our region. From Latin America, the fact that our governments make these calls public is very important in our advocacy and campaigns. And finally, I would like to mention in the current initiative and campaign that we are working on with most of the organizations that are in this panel, is an open letter to the G20 and the IMF asking for principles for reallocation of special drawing rights. So I will share the link in the chat if you have not seen yet, because GCAP is part also of this initiative. You may check this form and sign this letter on. And finally, I would like to invite you to a high-level event that we are organizing. GCAP is one of the co-organizers as well, on special drawing rights. And this event is to make the most of special drawing rights. This event will take place in the Civil Society Policy Forum of the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. It will be Monday on October 4th at 8 a.m. East time. You are all invited. Follow up on GCAP. They are part of the co-organizers, and they will share the best way to link and get connected to this event. It will be a high-level event with the IMF, with a former director of a central bank, but also with civil society organizations putting on the table and on the agenda or our demands and calls. I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Patricia, for that very helpful update. And I think the links are already in the chat box if you wish to follow these campaigns more closely and to stay in touch. And of course, as civil society, we've also been calling for a much higher SDR allocation, that 650 billion is not enough. And really the call has been for 3 trillion, which is something also UNCTAD had been calling from the start of the crisis. So thank you so much, Patricia, for that update. And with this, we'll now move on to the last speaker. I will also invite everyone, if you have questions, feel free to type it in the chat box in the meantime, but we will open the floor for questions. And our next speaker is Sanya Reed-Smith with the Third World Network, and she will give us an update on the very important campaign around the TRIPS waiver and ISDS moratorium. Over to you, Sanya.
Thank you very much, and thank you for including us. I apologize that our Executive Director, Chee Ling, could not be here today. She had to speak in another meeting at this time. So as you all know, there's a shortage of COVID vaccines in developing countries and least developed countries, as you can see by these graphs about how many COVID vaccines have been administered in each country. So it's a bit small, but just to give you the idea, you can see that in the top left graph, the very small blue line at the bottom is low-income countries. And in the top right graph, the very small thin line of yellow at the top is Africa. So you can see already before you do it by population that low-income countries in Africa have received hardly any COVID vaccines. Then if you look in the bottom left, the map shows the proportion of the population that has been fully vaccinated. And this is actually a generous version because under 10% is all the same color. So in Africa, you see under 10%, but you don't know how much. And mostly the vaccines in Africa have been in Morocco, Tunisia, and a bit in South Africa and Zimbabwe. So most of the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, less than 1% of their population has been vaccinated because of a shortage of COVID vaccines. And as you know, many governments are borrowing in order to buy these COVID vaccines, like the Asian Development Bank just gave a $500 million loan to Pakistan to buy COVID vaccines and a $165 million loan to Nepal. And there's a shortage of these vaccines because there's not enough production and because some developed countries bought more than 5 times more than they need to vaccinate their whole population. So the COVID vaccines and the medicines used to treat COVID once you get it, the test kits to tell if you have COVID, the N95 masks that you wear, the ventilators, these are all protected by intellectual property. So that means that only these intellectual property owners can make the vaccine or the medicine or the test kit. So they have a monopoly. So these monopolies mean that other companies cannot start producing to increase the supply and bring the prices down. So one way to increase the production of vaccines and other things needed for COVID, like test kits, medicines, ventilators, and so on, would be to waive intellectual property protection at the World Trade Organization, which sets the rules on intellectual property protection for 164 countries. So South Africa and India and many other developing countries made a proposal on this almost a year ago now, I think, but it has been blocked by developed countries. And then the last ones who are blocking it are mostly the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Switzerland. So you can see in the bottom right graph that those countries who are blocking this waiver, which if this waiver went through, there could be more production of vaccines and lives could be saved. They themselves have vaccinated more than 50% of their population. So their citizens don't suffer if they block this waiver and intellectual property continues to restrict the production of vaccines and life-saving medicines and so on. But who suffers is Africa, where 4% of the population has been vaccinated, and low-income countries where 1.1% of the population has been fully vaccinated with COVID vaccines. And as you know, when you don't have enough vaccines, that means your alternatives to stop the spread of COVID and stop people dying and getting sick is lockdowns. And lockdowns are costly to the economy. It reduces tax revenue. The government debt increases as they have to try and help those who have lost their jobs because of it, not to mention the cost of the medicines and the hospitalization and the ventilators and the lost working time and tax that can be paid by people who are permanently disabled or pass away. So on the next slide, it just shows you a map of which countries are supporting the COVID TRIPS waiver and who is opposing. This has not been updated yet with Australia, who recently decided to support this waiving of intellectual property protection for COVID technology at the World Trade Organization. And the US has recently, like in May, supported waiving intellectual property protection, but only on COVID vaccines, nothing else. So they still want intellectual property protection and monopolies on the medicines to treat people once they have COVID, the ventilators, the test kits, the N95 masks, and everything else. And some of those medicines, like the monoclonal antibodies, are very effective. They're 70% effective at keeping somebody who has COVID out of the hospital. It stops COVID from getting worse. But they cost $2,100 per dose. That's the monopoly price. So how many developing countries and LDCs can afford that? And then if they don't have these medicines, then the people who get infected with COVID in developing countries and LDCs have to go to hospitals where developing countries don't have enough ventilators or oxygen or ICU beds and so on, or healthcare workers, and it costs them more, and the government goes into more debt to pay for it. And because these monoclonal antibody medicines are, again, patented or have other intellectual property protection, other companies cannot make it, so there's a shortage and the price is so high. So this would be another technology that would benefit if this intellectual property protection is waived. But as you can see, the UK, EU, and Switzerland, all those red X's, are blocking this waiver from being agreed at the WTO. So there's a lot more information on this at the bottom of the slide, and links to some of the many campaigns on this issue. On the next slide, you'll see that investor to state dispute settlement has also been an issue for a long time. So this comes up through more than 2,800 bilateral investment treaties, which most countries have. And you can see that at the first link, which countries have which treaties. And these provisions protecting the rights of foreign investors also come up in investment chapters of many free trade agreements. So what these provisions say is the substantive rules include often there must be free movement of capital, so then you can't have capital management techniques, for example, to prevent a financial crisis or in the event of one. They also say often that you cannot reduce the value of the investment, so you can imagine taxation or sovereign debt restructuring reduces the value of the investment because investment is broadly defined to include shares, future profits, all kinds of things, intellectual property and so on. And then these provisions are enforced via investor to state dispute settlement, or ISDS. And this is where the foreign investor is allowed to sue the host government at an international tribunal, for example, at the World Bank. And there have been a lot of these cases. The publicly known ones are there on the slide in the second link. And when they sue, these treaties usually enable the foreign investor to get unlimited monetary damages plus interest at a commercially normal interest rate, and that interest can be compounded every month, not once a year, from the date the government takes action, for example, imposes a tax or does sovereign debt restructuring. So in that second link, which shows the ISDS cases that are publicly known, there are 14 known ISDS cases where the government has had to pay more than $1 billion per case to the foreign investor. And this includes Pakistan, who recently had to pay $5.9 billion when they lost one case. That's 13% of their annual budget and most of their foreign exchange reserves. And of course, Pakistan in 2019 had just received an IMF loan of $6 billion. So basically they had to hand over the entire IMF loan to the foreign investor because they lost one ISDS case, while they still had to comply with all the strict austerity conditions that the IMF imposed on that loan, which had been so bad that they caused nationwide strikes. So they had to comply with all the conditions, but they didn't get the money because they just had to give it all to the foreign investor because they lost one ISDS case. So you can see on the slide that the Prime Minister of Pakistan said, therefore, there should be a moratorium on ISDS cases against developing countries, and these kinds of treaties should be cancelled. So since then, Pakistan has decided to terminate most of its bilateral investment treaties and stopped ratifying the rest. There have also been many ISDS cases on sovereign debt restructuring. So for example, when Argentina had its terrible financial crisis and they did sovereign debt restructuring, they were sued by more than 60,000 bondholders in one case, and it was settled and the Argentine government had to pay them $1.35 billion in compensation. There have also been a lot of ISDS cases challenging governments imposing taxes. I forgot to put the link to that in the slide. I'll put it in the chat. And these were all before COVID. So even before COVID, a number of governments found these treaties were problematic because they have not been proven to attract foreign direct investment, and yet they restrict your policy and regulatory space, including to do sovereign debt restructuring, capital management techniques, impose taxes, and so on. So Bolivia, Ecuador, India, Indonesia, South Africa, Venezuela have been terminating their investment treaties. And you can see there that some of the recent free trade agreements, like the US, Mexico, Canada one, mostly removed ISDS from its predecessor. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, ASEAN +5, currently has no ISDS, and governments like New Zealand stop ISDS even in free trade agreements that have it with countries that also agree not to have it. But these foreign investors are still using ISDS to sue under the other thousands of existing bilateral investment treaties and free trade agreement investment chapters. So, for example, in this pandemic, we've seen law firms telling investors how to sue governments using ISDS to challenge their COVID measures. And the foreign investors are already starting to sue. For example, they're suing Chile for the COVID measures that Chile took using ISDS. So civil society organizations from around the world have been calling on governments to stop the use, don't allow ISDS for claims on COVID measures, don't spend any money on ISDS awards during the pandemic, you need to spend it on other things like life-saving vaccines and medicines, stop negotiating and signing and ratifying these treaties that have ISDS, and terminate your existing treaties with ISDS. And the link in the middle of that slide has where you can still sign your organization onto that letter if you want. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Sanya, again, for in very short time, very comprehensively giving that update as well. And I know this was a lot of information on a lot of different issues, and in a very short time to get through. But as you've heard, there are really a lot of different exciting campaigns that are ongoing at the moment to really join these conversations and to mobilize, even as we're very limited and can't do things in person, to really mobilize virtually. So we would really encourage all of you to follow these links, and if there are issues that you're interested in, to please join us. With this, I will open the floor for any questions or comments. I think we would be able to give you the floor if you raise your hand, or you're welcome to type your question in the chat box. I think we have 10 minutes, so please do not be shy. I don't see any hands, but maybe I will abuse my moderator role, and maybe Sanya, just starting with you. Can you maybe give an update on what the process looks like with the TRIPS waiver now? Like what's happening next? Are governments still talking? Is there a negotiation process? Maybe just a little bit of like what the timeline is and what to expect from that process now. Thanks.
Just there is one question in the chat if you want.
Okay, I Claudio, I've noted your question. So maybe Sanya, you can answer this, and I will get to Claudio's question after that, and feel free others to type it in the chat box in the meantime. Thanks.
Yeah, so thanks for that question. So the negotiations for waiving intellectual property protection are happening in the World Trade Organization, and they're continuous meetings kind of quite regularly. It can be decided at any time. If tomorrow the remaining developed countries who are blocking it stopped blocking it, then they could call a general council meeting and the waiver could go through tomorrow and production could start of vaccines and medicines and test kits and everything else. But there's some thinking that it might be delayed until the WTO Ministerial Conference, which is scheduled for November, the end of November this year. And if it goes to there, it may be traded off against many other things, agriculture and fishery subsidies and so on. So that's scheduled from the 30th of November to the 3rd of December. But it has already been postponed once from last year because of COVID. So it's a kind of ongoing process, and any campaigning is welcome at any time. There's not kind of a key date. The sooner the better, and there's no date that it has to be done by. But it's been going for so long. I'll put in the chat the date that the discussion started.
Great, thank you so much, Sanya. Okay, there's just a couple of questions from Claudio in the chat box that I will read. One to Iolanda about As for debt canceling, would that promote a cascade of ISDS as the case in Argentina? And if you have any reflections on that. And I think for Chennai, whether there were discussions in the G7 for a higher tax rate and why did it land at 15%? There's also a question from Hughes. Apologies, I don't know if someone could maybe translate the question, if one of the translators is either able to take the floor and translate it or type it in the chat box, that would be helpful. But okay, in the meantime, Iolanda and Iolanda and Chennai, you can answer those two questions. Thanks.
I can start if you want. Yes, of course, not the debt cancellation, but a debt suspension, like unilateral suspension of payments by borrowing countries could promote a cascade of trials and court cases like the one in Argentina. What we're trying to promote here are legislative changes, both in New York and the UK and London, which are the main legislative areas where the debt contracts are based on, to precisely protect those governments that need to actually or sovereignly decide to suspend the payments, debt payments. There are other options, including Article 8 of the IMF agreements and other options we're exploring. But the proposals we're putting out there is not only for the possibility of governments to unilaterally decide not to pay illegitimate debts, for instance, but also for creditors to cancel those unsustainable and illegitimate debts. And that wouldn't lead to this type of court cases. And more than that, and I was going to say in the long term, but it's actually in the very short term, what we need is a multilateral system, rules-based, that actually protect countries in debt distress situation to restructure and get the debt cancellation they need to comply with human rights obligations, for instance, or climate investment. So this is why we're pushing so hard with some of the friends here for this multilateral debt resolution framework, because the solutions that the G20 has put on the table, as the cases like Chad or Zambia exemplify, are not more than false solutions. They are not dealing with the problem, and they are not delivering the debt cancellation and not even the debt restructuring that the countries need. So yeah, there are different things that we could do for avoiding situations like the one that Argentina had to suffer.
Thank you, Iolanda. I see now there are hands coming up and I'm actually worried we'll run out of time, but Chennai, over to you.
I realized I was talking to myself there for a bit. I'll be really brief with my answer, I think, because of the hands that are going up. But the current conversation around the global corporate minimum tax was sort of spearheaded by the United States this year. It was the end of last year, beginning of this year, when the Biden administration wanted to actually propose 21% global minimum tax. But when they then met as the G7, I think the what's that word called? The compromise was 15%. And I recall all of them coming out, including the United States rep, Janet Yellen, saying that we have agreed to a global minimum tax of 15%, and them calling it a historical agreement. I know, though, that the United States is likely to implement a much higher domestic corporate income tax, but it was largely just due to discussions and conversations amongst the G7 ministers themselves that they arrived at the 15%. even though I think 21% was something that quite a few countries had actually rallied behind. And so we're quite disappointed to then see the 15% come out and be the one purported. Thanks, Pooja.
Thanks, Chennai. And maybe just to add that with the way the current tax system is, even if they were to agree a 35% global tax rate, most of the revenues will still just go to OECD countries and maybe a couple of emerging economies, because that is how the system and the global norms right now operate. So the proposal from developing countries in the negotiations was to actually fix that. That was the G24 proposal. That's what ATAF has been talking about, is the distribution of revenues between countries. And unfortunately now, of course, with this global minimum tax, all the revenues just goes to OECD countries. Okay, we have two hands. Ruminiga Michelle, apologies if I'm pronouncing your names incorrectly, and Georgina Munoz. So Ruminiga first and then Georgina, thanks. Oh. Can we unmute Ruminiga?
De mon pays,
Voy a pedir
le
a
Rwanda,
Héctor.
voilà, mon pays, le Rwanda, qui est petit, de 1000 collines et de 1000 problèmes. Et voilà, la société civile n'existe presque pas. Et les actions de la société civile, si la société civile ne fait pas l'apologie du gouvernement, on est considéré comme des gens qui sont au contraire, qui sont opposés, comme des opposants au pouvoir. Et voilà, maintenant la question c'est de savoir comment vraiment trouver des solutions pour avoir l'accès au financement des actions de la société civile. Parce que aussi longtemps que la société civile n'ont pas des moyens, des ressources pour mener à bien leurs actions, ne seront pas exécutés. Et cela pour conséquence, voilà, et surtout pour les pays qui vivent en dessous au sein de la pauvreté, à moins de $2 par jour. Et tout cela, ça cause vraiment des problèmes de non-participation dans différentes activités. Et voilà, non seulement cela, mais aussi dans la planification du budget de l'État. Et voilà, et la pauvreté. Une autre question, ça concerne les pays les plus endettés au monde. Qui paiera ces dettes? C'est nous, nos enfants et nos arrière-enfants. Et pourtant, et voilà, et on ne sait pas, il y a toujours les problèmes de détournement des fonds qui s'expliquent partout, par ici, par là, dans des pays, et par les gouvernements, par les districts, les organes exécutifs qui détournent les budgets.
Sorry, can I request you to maybe...
Et voilà, tout ça, c'est toujours à la charge du citoyen. C'est le citoyen qui paiera tout ça. Et pourtant, le citoyen n'a pas été consulté pour prendre cette dette-là. Et voilà, et tout ça, c'est le citoyen qui est toujours victime. Et voilà, donc, c'est une situation qui est un peu compliquée, mais voilà, et pour les actions de la société civile,
merci beaucoup,
là,
Michel.
vraiment,
On va devoir couper.
Il faut trouver un mécanisme de financement.
Oui, Michel, il va falloir couper pour le temps.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we'll have to close the session now. But I think that's actually a really good way to close it, because indeed, I think the fact is these decisions happen in a way where we don't have a say as people. A lot of these forums are so undemocratic, and we're the ones who are paying the price ultimately. And so I'm so sorry. I know we want to continue this conversation, and I'm sorry that we didn't have enough time, but we're going to close now. Yes, can you hear me? Oh,
yes.
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can. Yeah, we can.
Okay. Yeah. So thank you everyone for this, for joining us today, and please do stay in touch with all the campaigns that we've shared information on. Apologies for going over time. Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone
Thanks,
for
Pooja.
coming.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks to all the
Thanks for
speakers. Thanks
moderating.
to our translators as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ciao.